Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, thousands of anti-war protesters in Russia have taken to the streets, and thousands have been arrested for it. According to the Russian human rights media organization OVD Info, nearly 15,000 people were detained between February and March of 2022 alone.
The Russian government has essentially outlawed even the mildest forms of protest, but that hasn't stopped the Russian people from making their objections heard. No to war, many of them shouted as they gathered in various cities during that first month of the invasion.
Here in the United States, a strong majority support Ukraine over Russia, with polls showing that in fall 2025, over 60% of Americans support military aid to Ukraine, up from about 50% the previous year. And it's easy to understand why. Russia, the more powerful nation, is known for its human rights abuses and has a history of invading other countries.
The Catholic idea of just war theory dates back to St. Augustine, and on its face, some people might argue that Ukraine's current situation fits the criteria of being a just war, that given all of this that we just talked about, they are justified in defending themselves against an unjust aggressor. But some anti-war activists have issues with this thesis. Organizations like the British Anti-War Coalition believe that arming Ukraine against Russia will lead to a war between Russia and all the NATO countries, and that negotiations are the only moral option.
And what is a just war anyway? Is it even possible for a war to be just? That's what we're discussing on this episode of Glad You Asked.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask, but not so easy to answer.
Hi, Emily. I'm looking forward to today's discussion. How about you?
There are so many ethical issues intersecting here in the conversation around just war that it should be a really informative conversation.
Yeah, I have really mixed feelings about this topic, and strong ones too. I was a pacifist for many years, and my dad was a conscientious objector during Vietnam. But I'm also really proud of my grandfathers who served in World War II. I love that my mild-mannered Jewish grandpa faced the Nazis in France, and I have family in the military today. So on one hand, I believe there are evils so great they must be resisted, and nations have a right to defend themselves when an aggressor is unjust. At the same time, every war, even the most theoretically justified, involves so much destruction and misery.
You're not the only one to have mixed feelings, right? Like, even the Catholic Church seems to have very mixed feelings about war and the place of war. On the one hand, we have such strong condemnations of violence in the Gospels. The early church rejected war, and many saints and holy people across generations have held to that teaching, including Pope Francis, who said straight out that there is no such thing as a just war.
And at the same time, the church was instrumental in developing the idea that a war can be just. And it developed a set of conditions that a war has to meet in order to be just.
Look at Christian history, all the wars that were waged not just by Christians, but for supposedly Christian reasons. The Crusades are maybe the most obvious example, knights going off with crosses on their armor to invade and attack another region, believing that they were serving God for doing so. If even Christians who profess to follow Jesus, who we call the Prince of Peace, get so bloodthirsty and wage such vicious wars, how can war ever possibly be acceptable? In this episode of Glad You Asked, we're going to talk about just war theory, what it is, and where it came from, and whether it's ever possible for a war to be just. I'm Emily Santa, one of the hosts.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. Before we get into the interview, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now, back to the question of the day. Is there such a thing as a just war?
To help us answer this question, we talked to author and activist David Swanson. Swanson is executive director of Worlds Beyond War and campaign coordinator of rootsaction.org. His books include War is a Lie and When the World Outlawed War.
Swanson has been awarded the Real Nobel Peace Prize, an alternative award supported by the Lay Down Your Arms Association and inspired by the belief that the Nobel Committee has strayed from Alfred Nobel's original vision. He's the recipient of the 2018 Peace Prize from the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation and has been involved in multiple peace organizations, including Nobel Peace Prize Watch, Veterans for Peace, Military Families Speak Out, the Transnational Foundation, and Warheads to Windmills. David, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
So to start us off, what is just war theory? What are the prerequisites for a war to be just according to this theory? And kind of where did the idea come from and what's its current status? Just give us the lay of the land.
It's an ancient set of ideas. I mean, this is something that came out of the 3rd century. People like Saint Ambrose and Augustine, when the Christian religion, which up until that point had advocated largely for nonviolence and non-killing and non-murder, became the official religion of an empire. And when you are the official religion of an empire, you have to justify killing. You have to justify invasion and aggression and expansion. And so this is what it did. And these were people who believed in almost nothing we currently believe in other than, Christianity in some vague sense if you're a Christian, because they believed in slavery and monarchy and killing pagans. And I mean, the thinking that's sort of behind this is the thinking of St. Augustine that if someone's killing you, they're doing you a favor. You're going to heaven. Don't be an idiot and get in the way of somebody who's trying to kill you. The sexism, the racism, the slavery, the monarchy, the imperialism, nothing that these people thought is currently thought of as, these gentlemen who had many fine characteristics, but Ambrose and Augustine, and then later, several centuries later, Aquinas, they believed almost nothing that I currently believe, or most people currently believe to be proper ethical behavior, right? I mean, even Aquinas, heretics should be killed, but, ideally the state should do it instead of the church. Church shouldn't do it, and yet this bizarre theory of how you justify wars is still alive in the minds of many. It's the only thing, right, that's still alive out of the whole worldview of these people. And it's very strange that it's still alive, only in parts of the world, only in parts of the world that have been imperialistic, right? When back in around 2016, when they were having meetings at the Vatican in Rome about whether to issue an encyclical, an official statement from the Pope declaring that war can never be just, the people who went to that meeting from places like North America discovered that people who came from Africa and the Middle East and, the global South not only didn't agree with them on just war theory, but had never heard of it, right? It had never come up, right? Because they didn't come from nations that had done big empires. And so the theory, I mean, we can talk about it in any detail you want, but the theory was and is that if you can have a war, meet certain criteria, you can label it a just war. And you can do this for stuff that happens before the war, after the war, the initiation of the war, the conduct of the war. And the criteria are things like correct intention, proportionality, just cause. These are things that are not measurable, empirical. These are just pulled out of thin air, but these are just made up, right? Then other criteria like it's a last resort, there's a reasonable prospect of success, non-combatants are immune from attack, right? This is in an age when, almost all victims of wars are non-combatants. Enemy soldiers are respected as human beings. I mean, I'm sorry, there are lots of ways to respect somebody. None of them include killing that person. Prisoners of war are treated as non-combatants. Well, no, they aren't. They cannot be. These are all things that are not possible, including last resort. We can talk about it's not possible. And then the final category that I put these criteria in The war is publicly declared. The war is waged by a legitimate and competent authority. These are not moral factors at all, right? A bomb lands on your house. You don't, rush outside wailing and screaming you've lost your family, but you're just hoping and praying that Congress did it instead of the president. Like, nobody could possibly care less. It has nothing to do with morality. But you take all these factors and add them up, and you're supposed to be, if you've done some of them or all of them, you can declare a war to somehow be just. And so not only are these nonsensical, if not impossible, factors, and so no war is ever a just war by the criteria of this theory itself, but it serves to put into everybody's mind the notion that a war can be just. And this perpetuates the funding of the war machine that gives us all the wars, most of which, if not all of which, everybody agrees were not just. But there's this ideal of the one that might be just that, leaves us spending over $1 trillion just in this one little country every year on war. And the money the good things that money could have gone to costs us more lives and more suffering than all the wars put together until the wars go nuclear. And so back again in 2016, when these meetings were happening, there was an author who contacted, I think it was 50 or more experts on wars and just wars and so forth, and asked anyone, can you find an example anywhere of a war that's been prevented or significantly altered by just war theory? And he couldn't, not a single one, right? There has to be some sort of, influence on different laws and standards of war as a result of just war theory, but no one can offer an example of where it actually prevented an unjust war or made an unjust war just. On the other hand, its very existence, the notion that you can have a just war, perpetuates the war machine, keeps the war machine respectable, good, liberal, and humanitarian. So I would do away with not just war, but also with just war theory.
So going back to the early Christians, people who were dedicated to nonviolence, who took seriously Jesus's commandments to turn the other cheek, who would have been, dedicated to principles of do not kill. How do you think they would have regarded this idea that a war could be just?
Well, I have to assume they would have been outraged, as many people, Christian and otherwise, and Catholic and otherwise, have been to this day, right? You look even centuries after the birth of just war theory, you look at somebody like Erasmus, who's wonderful Catholic thinker from the Netherlands, right? Erasmus is now the name of the foreign exchange programs that all the European kids do from one country to another in Europe. Oh, let's do an Erasmus program. But this was a guy who would look at the general support and oblivious acceptance of NATO and the nuclear weapons all over Europe and the war machine with absolute outrage and disgust. This was someone who declared that no Christian who ever picked up a sword or a gun or joined a military should ever be allowed anywhere near being buried in a Christian cemetery. This was an outrage to the very idea of Christianity. And as someone who's not a Christian, it was an outrage to the very idea of human decency, right? Erasmus was a smart guy and he was right. And I suspect he agreed with most of the people who were Christians for about the first 300 years of their being Christians, right? It was a religion of nonviolence, and then in various sects and groups and individuals has remained so ever to this day. Many of our best peace activists are Christians and say they are peace activists precisely because they are Christian and for their Christian belief, just like many of our top warmongers say they are warmongers because of their Christian beliefs. I like the former group,
So it seems as if latent in just war theory is this idea that Christian morality has to be balanced against the realities of living in the world. Like that war is somehow inevitable, so we need to kind of bend over backwards to make it semi-moral, right? But on other issues, Christians don't do that sort of mental gymnastics, right? There are plenty of moral issues where we're just told we have to hold resolutely to certain ideals, no matter the reality of the world around us. Why is war, this thing that is so destructive, that leads to so much loss of life, the thing that we work so hard to say is okay morally?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that, and we could go for hours, right? I mean, the fact is that there are countries like the one I'm in that spend millions of dollars every year to get people to think that. There are advertisements on television. There are sponsorships of sports games. There are recruitment offices on every corner. I mean, if war were simply inevitable, natural, and so forth, why would you need to spend millions and millions of dollars to make it happen? Why would there be a story yesterday, as we're speaking, of over 900 people in the U.S. Air Force killing themselves because they weren't macho monsters? They were human beings, and they had problems with what they were being told to do. The fact is, war has only ever been conducted by a very small minority of a population. Most people stay the heck away from it, even in the most militarized places, including this country. And those who don't, those who take part in it, even from the aggressive and the victorious side, even from the side with 1% of the casualties, even for the people who sit in a trailer in Nevada and push a button and blow people up thousands of miles away, for almost all of them, it's very, very hard to take. It's not. I can't make any sense out of this concept of natural. But if anything's natural, it's not that. It's not war. But it's very, very, very profitable, and it does play into the very worst parts of human tendencies among the sort of people who are current structures of government and society tends to empower to the disadvantage of all the rest of us. And so you have this institution of war that is kept going by this fantasy that somehow one of them could be justified, or one of them a long time ago was justified. And so most average pick a random person in the United States, I talk to them for a few minutes, I can discover that they believe we've had hundreds of unjust wars. And the last war that was good and just and noble and decent was World War II, right? You're talking about 80 years ago. And so the top government expense and program for 80 years is justified by the bizarrely false notion, of course, that there was one that was good and noble 80 years ago in a completely different world. And that seems to be enough not to get people to actually support the incredible military spending and the new wars after wars after wars, right? The polling of the U.S. public wouldn't create the military budget. It wouldn't launch a new war on Venezuela, but at least to get people to accept it, and to get people to accept the idea that the government knows better than they do. If it blows up boats full of people and says there's a good reason, well, it's your duty to accept that. This is one of the negative characteristics in my mind of religions, all of them, is that they tell people to accept things without understanding because somebody up at the front of the church said so, right? Bad idea, especially a bad idea with governments, especially a bad idea with very, very corrupt governments that are profiting from the horrible things they're telling you to accept on faith. Shouldn't do it.
Let's just put ourselves within the framework of just war theory for a minute. Within that framework, if we look at the current status of our military technology and our military methods, could it even be justified within that framework to say that war today is legitimate? If we're looking at modern conflicts like Ukraine, Gaza, do these really kind of challenge the limits of just war reasoning, even for people who are willing to accept that a war could be just?
I mean, one would certainly hope so. They certainly do for me. And not that I think there was an age when the technology was so primitive that war was okay. But I think there are two main reasons why it's absurd today to talk about this as being justified. One is that even if you could get one out of every 50 or 100 wars to seem justified to your mind, you'd still have the problem of the other 49 or 99 that are outrageous mass murder slaughters of men, women, and children. And the institution that does that, the institution of war, that is one of our leading creators of death, injury, and trauma, is also our leading creator of homelessness, a major contributor to the destruction of our natural environment, the major impediment to global cooperation on urgent crises that are not optional, that aren't created by warmongering madmen. It is, as I mentioned, the biggest drainer of resources, of money that's needed elsewhere. It's the creator of the nuclear risk, which is as high as it's ever been and growing. And we have been very, very lucky heretofore. It is the justification for government secrecy and surveillance and impediment to self-governance. It is a concentrator of wealth and power. It is the way our police get militarized, the way people get weapons, the way the most brutal governments on earth get weapons, many of them from the U.S. government and U.S. weapons dealers. It's where a lot of the private guns and a huge percentage of the mass shooters come from. They've been trained to shoot for things we're supposed to praise them for, and then they shoot in the wrong place, and we're supposed to denounce them. It's where the troops come from that are now invading U.S. cities. It's where the foreign bases come from that prop up dictatorships. It intersects with so many issues. It's such a horrific institution that you have to factor in the idea that when you're supporting one particular war, you're also supporting this entire institution in the long run. But that being said, how in the heck can you get a war in this day and age or any other that meets all of these criteria, that doesn't slaughter non-combatants? I mean, it's precisely since World War II and including World War II that the majority of those killed and injured and traumatized are precisely non-combatants. If you got to do anything with that criterion at all, you're going to have to go back before World War II, back before your cherished, prized, so-called just war.
So what's the relationship between just war and pacifism? Can you be against the war machine that we have come up with, say there's no such thing as a just war, without also saying you're a pacifist? Examples that we came up with were things like John Brown, or even kind of acts of force that are non-lethal, using force to stop someone who's trying to rape someone. Is there a moral difference between personal violence and state-sanctioned violence?
Well, I think there are many huge differences between those two things. And I think it's very telling that when I've done debates on whether you can ever have a just war with professors and U.S. military officials, they almost never want to talk about any wars. I ask them for examples of just wars. Come on, give me one. And it's like pulling teeth. But they want to talk the whole evening about what I would do in a dark alleyway with my grandmother being mugged. And I have to say, it's not the same question. It's just not. To spend years and years investing trillions of dollars that we badly need for housing and food and healthcare and environment on building an institution that builds momentum for industrial scale slaughter is just not the same as the question of whether I would use anything violent or nonviolent in trying to protect my grandmother in a dark alleyway. And so in parts of the world like Europe, where they use the word pacifist to mean someone organizing against war, yes, I'm a pacifist. But in the United States, where the word pacifist means let's talk about your grandmother in a dark alleyway and there's a mugger coming, no, I'm not a pacifist. I'm going to do whatever. Now, there are nonviolent approaches that are vastly more successful than these people imagine in what you might do in a dark alleyway. But in the event that something more violent seems more useful, I'm going to use something more violent in that dark alleyway. It's just not the same question. It's a very different question. I will quibble, however, with this notion that, well, we can find sort of medium scale uses of violence and throw out the name John Brown, and that creates a problem for the argument. Because up until John Brown did what he did at Harper's Ferry, there was still a chance of avoiding the ridiculously, outrageously unnecessary mass slaughter of 750,000 people and the destruction of cities and the creation of bitterment and resentment that has not died out to this day. Just look at Washington, D.C. right now. You didn't have to have a civil war, and you can't just take a nice cause that we all agree with, like abolishing slavery, and stamp it on a war and say, oh, that's a good war now. Most of the world had slavery. Most of the world had slavery or serfdom that was just about like slavery and got rid of it. The whole stinking world, 3/4 of the planet got rid of it in less than a century, mostly without a horrific war that killed 750,000 people. In fact, there were established means being practiced to get rid of it. There were things like compensated emancipation, which Washington, D.C. itself did, the capital of the place that used the worst means of anyone to get rid of slavery, did compensated emancipation, which sounds disgusting, right? You compensate the people who've been enslaving people. No, you should compensate the people who've been enslaved. But if your alternative is killing half the people and burning the city down, actually the nonviolent way, and there were, nobody talks about it, but there were negotiations to try to avoid the Civil War right up until the day of the Civil War began. And they couldn't get anywhere because of what John Brown had done, because he had stirred up so much emotion and hostility. And you just weren't going to, there wasn't the mindset to fit. Nobody knew how bad the thing was going to be until it was over, right? And so it's not that I disagree with John Brown on wanting to end slavery and wanting to not wait a single minute to end slavery. But what he did created the worst possible means of ending slavery. And it's not clear at all that there weren't far better ways of doing it, which is, and people will say, but it didn't happen. Well, of course it didn't happen. And the slave owners didn't want to be compensated. Of course they didn't, but it doesn't mean that if we wanted today to end something bad like capital punishment or mass incarceration, the thing to do would be to pick out some big fields and have young people slaughter each other by the millions, and then pass legislation to end mass incarceration. No, we would just jump straight to passing legislation to end mass incarceration. That would be the civilized way to do it, right? And so I just quibble with saying John Brown and thinking that's a problem for nonviolence.
So this kind of leads into the next question. A common criticism of pacifism or nonviolence or anti-war activism is that there's this allowance of people to do terrible things, and that therefore taking this stance is a kind of privilege. Dorothy Day famously opposed World War II. In cases like that, or let's say cases in Ukraine or in Gaza, if people are like actually attacking you, what would you say to the criticism of pacifism that this is kind of a stance of privilege, that if you're actually in the position of right now, this army is coming at you and they're going to destroy your village and they're going to destroy your family, you got to fight back?
Yeah, I would say you have to use the most effective strategic tools to prevent that harm that are available to you. And they may be tools that were not available to your ancestors who didn't know what they were. And the notion that the very worst thing that humanity has ever done to itself and the rest of the life on this planet in any short space of time, namely World War II, is this giant example of the justness and necessity of mass slaughter, is a very troubled one. For most people in the United States are taught that the United States played a big role in the victory in Europe and Asia in World War II. Well, it did in Asia, but it really didn't in Europe. This was the dreaded commies who did 80% of this, and that there wasn't this idiotic buildup to World War II. I mean, everybody loves to take their time machine back to the worst possible moment, but not a week earlier or a month earlier or 10 years earlier, right? And so when you have years and years of U.S. corporate and government support for the buildup of these horrific governments in Europe, and in some cases right through the course of the war, and then you act as if it just came out of the blue and it wasn't your doing, that you didn't teach them eugenics and so forth. And you ask people, well, name a just war. I do this magic trick where I say, name a just war, and I write down World War II, and they all say World War II. And I say, I read your minds. It's inevitable. They say World War II because thousands and thousands of hours of Hollywood films and novels and children's books. I mean, our culture is just saturated. And you say, why? Why World War II? And they say death camps, right? They say genocide, right? And you say, well, was there any possibility of preventing that? Oh, no, God, well, you had to win the war first, and then and nobody knows, right? That for years, up until and during World War II, there were big public meetings about who in the world would take the future victims of these death camps, who would take the Jews, who would take all the people that Hitler hated, and nobody would take them. And Hitler, I'll put them all on luxury cruise ships. I'll send them anywhere. Who will take them? And the U.S. government organized meetings of diplomats and legislators from around the world, the nation's governments, and they all proudly said, without a bit of shame and complete racism and anti-Semitism, we won't take these people, right? Just openly bigoted. And Hitler said, look, they agree with me. They say I'm evil, but they actually agree with me. And then you have Crystal Night, and you have all the uptick in the horrors in Germany. And through the course of the war, you had the good, including the major religious leaders in the United States and in England, going to the State Department and going to the British government, the Foreign Secretary, and saying, let these people out. Do a pause and let the people out. And the response was, oh, we can't be bothered. We've got a war to fight. It would never work. But internally, the discussion was, well, yeah, this is what the Nazis want. They'd go along with this, but where would we put these people? Nobody wants them. We don't want them. We won't do it. And so you have this refusal to save these people. We all feel so self-righteous. We watch all these movies about Anne Frank, and we just don't care that the State Department turned down Anne Frank's family's application like everybody else's, right? Didn't want them, wouldn't take them. And so you have all of these myths. You have myths about nuclear bombs saving lives rather than costing lives. You have myths about Pearl Harbor coming out of the blue. Surprise, surprise. There had been no years of buildup to war with Japan, no marches in the streets of the United States opposing the buildup to war with Japan, as if none of this happened, right? You have all this mythology surrounding World War II. And then you have the fact that the nations that used nonviolence, that made efforts to protect the Jews and the leftists and all the groups of people that the Nazis wanted, were in some cases very, very successful. And even women in the heart of Berlin who had Jewish husbands who had been locked up staged a protest. Nobody even knew what a protest was. They had no idea what they were doing. They hadn't studied the strategy of nonviolent action. And yet they scared the living out of the Nazi government, which let the husbands go. And random people were starting to join in the protest, and they said, we're done, go home. They didn't escalate. They didn't come back the next day. They had no idea what to do with nonviolent activism. And now we do. Now it's a science. Now there are scholarly studies of what works and what doesn't, and how to innovate and how to escalate, and overwhelming evidence that nonviolent action, even against an invasion, even against a dictatorship, even against an occupation, is more likely to succeed than principally violent action. And so this notion that you must resort to the thing that's less likely to succeed I mean, it's just as sensible as climate denial. It's history denial, right? It doesn't fit with the facts, and so unarmed civilian defense is a tool that nobody wants to talk about when they all want to talk about that moment when you've made all the mistakes, but now the violence has happened and you're under attack. I'm not talking about, again, my grandmother in the alleyway or the people busting through the door in your house, but I'm talking about on a mass scale. Unarmed civilian defense has overthrown governments, has protected countries. I mean, in recent months, we've seen the people of South Korea stop martial law and stop a military takeover of their country with nonviolence. We've seen it in Bolivia. We've seen it in a number of countries in Africa. I mean, you can go back through the years, and it's just dozens and dozens, and increasingly successful cases. We've seen in Thailand a student-led movement overthrow the government, and this is just not talked about in the do something or do nothing, war or lie back and take it, binary choices that are offered to us by CNN. It's, there are many, many other things to do, right? There's disarmament, there's diplomacy, there's negotiation, there's cooperation, there's actual aid, there's avoidance of conflicts. But in that moment of conflict, the people of Ukraine in the polling wanted to use unarmed civilian defense, wanted their country to do it, and on a small scale did it. Hundreds of examples, talking people out of the tanks, turning people around. But on a mass scale, their national government wanted nothing to do with it and wanted everybody armed and wanted everybody in the military. And if you didn't want to be in the military, you better find a sneaky way to get out of the country. So, and of course, the reason is not that the evidence isn't strong enough. The evidence could be stronger. It's relatively new, but it's that governments know that if you train people to resist a foreign invasion, you're also training them to resist your own oppression and injustices. And governments don't want their people able to resist them. This is the real hurdle.
So Pope Francis agreed with you, right? He famously said, "No war is just." Was that moment when he said that, did that mark like a real departure in kind of the conversation around just war theory? Or was it more kind of a development of things that have been happening kind of up to that point?
Well, I think, a lot of people wanted him to go just a millimeter farther, right? They wanted this official encyclical and didn't get it. But they got speeches. They got wonderful speeches on New Year's Day and otherwise saying you can't have a just war, saying you need to have a just peace and a theory of just peace, not just war. And I suspect that Pope Francis had his thinking along these lines before he was Pope, and certainly many other people did. And there were particular cardinals there in Italy and around the world, and activists around the world who followed in the tradition of Dorothy Day, who was right as rain, who were advocating for this. And so when meetings were organized to discuss it at the Vatican, people came from around the world to discuss it. I was honored to have people take copies of my book, No War is Ever Just, and give it to people there. But again, some of the people attending these meetings had never heard of just war theory, had to learn this nonsense in order to reject it, And yeah, I think it made a big difference, especially to Catholic people and Christian people, to have the Pope talking this way. I think it probably made a lot of people look into this, because even if you haven't heard the words just war theory and you haven't studied just war theory, this stuff is all over our culture. It's all in the news. It's all in these notions of the excusable killings, the the justified slaughters, the proportionality, was it proportionate? There's actually no calculation to tell you whether some mass killing is proportionate or not. It's just made up on the spot every single time. But it's there all over the newspaper articles, right? And so to sort of be exposed to the official dogma of just war theory and understand what's wrong with it opens a lot of people's eyes to questioning, the assumptions that are built into all the newspaper articles about every war. Here we are with, the president of the United States blowing up a boat or two full of people every day in the Caribbean or the Pacific. And the challengers, the people questioning this, the opposition is declaring, well, he's doing this without proper due process. He's doing this without showing us the documents to explain how it's justified. This is what we had good liberal lawyers telling Congress in hearings, in official testimony when President Obama was president. And we had these drone wars, blowing up people and anybody near them, based on whose phone they had in their hands, for years and years. Well, either it's mass murder and it's unacceptable, or it's perfectly fine because it's part of a war. It just depends on these documents that President Obama won't show us. He's got them hidden away in his desk, and we need to see these documents. This is like the height of the opposition now in Washington, D.C. to blowing up these boats is, well, they haven't shown us the paperwork to tell us if it's good blowing up boats or not. Well, what makes anybody imagine that it could be just war theory?
We always end these interviews by asking, what's the one thing you would like our audience to take away from this conversation?
Well, I'd like people to get engaged and get active. I work with a group called World Beyond War. I work with a group called Roots Action. There are wonderful peace and justice and democracy groups of all stripes and flavors in every corner of the world. But public opinion, limited as it always is, we all have our short-sightedness and our failures and our lack of information, but it's vastly better than public policy, but it needs to be acted on. When there was a threat of war on Iraq, there were people in the streets, and there's this myth that it made no difference. But it made that war illegal. It scaled back that war. It prevented future wars on Syria and on Iran because having supported that war on Iraq became a badge of shame. Now there's a war threatened on Venezuela. Crickets. Nothing. Go find a single person in a street, right? At least make a phone call to Congress. At least hold up a sign on a street corner for a minute. At least go and talk to your city council about passing a resolution. It doesn't matter if we all understand how ridiculous it is to believe ancient 3rd century mumbo jumbo if we don't act on it, So get out there and do something.
Well, thanks so much, David. That's all of our questions. Thank you again for being a guest today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much.
So David made some incredibly compelling arguments against the idea that war can ever be just.
He did, for sure. I don't know that I always agreed with him, but he definitely gave me a lot to think about. And I say this as someone who considers myself a strong pacifist.
Yeah, I kind of felt the same way. I think in spite of having spent years trying to kind of work this topic out on my own and having been a pacifist, as I mentioned, for years, David brought stuff up that I hadn't thought of, and I was really grateful to. I think that perhaps he's nudged me a little bit more back towards the hardcore pacifist position. Was there anything in the conversation that came up that surprised you?
I think what surprised me the most was just his certainty that war is always preventable, that there's no situation in human history that could not have been avoided if we all just sat down and did some diplomacy at some point in the process. And that was the point where I wasn't sure that I necessarily always agreed with him, that there seemed to be this very, I don't want to say like black and white, but like absolutism kind of underlying his pacifism. that just at some point, like, all of this could have been avoided, every single world conflict. And I think as part of that, it seemed like he had this very optimistic approach that I'm not sure, someone in Ukraine or someone in Gaza would necessarily agree with. I felt like he didn't really pay a lot of attention to kind of power dynamics or like imbalances in power. It was just all, this could have been avoided. And if it once it gets to the point where the tank is rolling down your street, stand there, I guess, like the Tiananmen Square man. I found that surprising, and also maybe a little simplistic.
And to be honest, that's actually the reason I'm not a pacifist anymore. I was really influenced by some pacifist thinkers in my circle, and everything they said was so compelling, but the World War II thing has always kind of stood out for me, and the Civil War thing as well. And you can say that these are the obvious wars that people bring up, but there's a reason why. I think when he was talking about how these wars could have been avoided, on some level, I think he's theoretically right. Like, if everyone just would behave like a rational animal, like we supposedly are, if everyone would just have some common sense, and we don't even have to be saints, just say, okay, well, this is stupid and we're not going to do it. But history seems to have demonstrated that people aren't going to operate according to that common sense. And so, yeah, what do you do when that tank is rolling towards you? What do you do when that tank is rolling towards your children?
Yeah, I think it's not that I disagreed with what he was saying. It was that I felt like, at least in this podcast, we didn't get to kind of consider the inequities inherent in it, and that the conversation kind of seemed like, well, everyone is on the same level when it comes to power, and that's just not true. And I think that influences how we talk about the possibilities of diplomacy or conversation. And like, yes, to your point, theoretically, in a world where everyone is rational, this is incredibly possible and there should not be a need for violence. I don't think that considers like the real world structural sin, for lack of a better word, that keeps that from being possible.
Yeah, I keep thinking about this we live in the real world argument that comes up often, and it's often used to justify bad stuff. Like, oh, well, we live in the real world, so we can't expect people to let immigrants in. Or we live in the real world and we have to just let billionaires keep their money. But flip that around, the marginalized live in the real world, and in the real world, no one's coming to help them. They hold no bargaining chips. At a negotiation table, they're going to often walk away realizing that they've been sacrificed by the powerful. So I think that I keep asking myself who gets to live in the real world, and it seems like it's always the powerful who get to live in the real world. And maybe we should start letting the vulnerable live in the real world and hold the powerful to these high ideals. How we do that, though, I don't know.
Yeah, I think structural sin is maybe a good way of thinking about it, right? That we live in a world where sin exists. And because of this, war is always going to be a part of it. And I don't think that means we start turning in these circles like Augustine did and saying, like, well, how can we make this sin the least sinful that we can? I don't think that's the answer. But I don't know. I think maybe there's something else there beyond the sin is preventable, because I don't know that it is in our world.
Yeah, I get the idea that we should work as hard as we possibly can to prevent it. And maybe that's kind of my biggest takeaway is that we should be pouring our resources into education and advocacy work to prevent war instead of making it just kind of this little side thing like, oh, yeah, we tried, but now we've invested trillions in war. What if we invested trillions in peace?
Yes, demilitarization, like the budget, like all of those things, I am 100% behind him on. So I guess that gets kind of to the next question, which is there anything that you wish we could have gone into more detail on in our conversation?
Yeah, I realized at some point that we hadn't really clarified for people who are new to the topic what just war is. And David did go over some of the prerequisites and kind of dismissed most of them, understandably enough. I thought some of his discourse around that, like, for instance, do you care if it's a legitimate authority? Oh, what makes it a legitimate authority? But yeah, maybe we could talk a little bit about what the conditions are. So there's two different ways of looking at it. One is that for a war to be just, it has to be for justified reasons. And the other is that it has to be waged justly. And it seems like that second one is really hard to get. So for a war to be fought for just reasons, it has to be fought to correct a grave, lasting, and certain wrong. So, slavery. It has to be declared by a lawful authority, such as a national government. It has to be a last resort. All other peaceful and nonviolent options must have been exhausted first. That seems plausible. It has to have a reasonable chance of success. I kind of get that, but then, of course, what do we mean by success?
And so then the other part of that is that a war must be waged justly. And so that includes things like a war should not harm innocent people or non-combatants. It shouldn't use inappropriate force. It must obey any internationally agreed conventions about how to do war. And it also must be proportional. The good that is achieved must outweigh the evil that the war will cause. Oh, and then I guess the final thing is that it cannot include things that are evil in themselves. So I guess that would be nuclear weapons would be the big obvious one, right?
And I kind of run up against issues with that last one because killing is always evil in itself. Now, I think from my ethical standpoint, I think that it can still be an act that is justified in the sense that a person's not going to be accountable for it. But the act itself, I think, remains evil. So, like, I don't know, what do we do? Like, wage war with paint guns? I would be all about that. Like, make people like play games of chess.
Yeah, I think something I wish that he'd gone into more detail about was these kind of real world examples of what it means to prevent a war before it happens. He kind of gave theoreticals like, well, if John Brown hadn't gone to Harper's Ferry, right, like the Civil War wouldn't have happened. Well, first of all, I don't know if that's actually true. I don't know enough about the Civil War. But second of all, like, are there kind of more real world examples of what prevention or de-escalation looked like, and can we apply those to other situations?
Yeah, I kept thinking about this because with the World War II example, like, oh gosh, we had to stop Germany because they were committing genocide. And I actually, support that. Those were my people. And even if they weren't my people, I would still support it. At the same time, we're seeing right now in real time how quickly people ignore escalating atrocity. And we can look back 80 years ago and say, oh my gosh, that was terrible. Why did no one do anything? And a lot of the same people who say that are going to say, well, the stuff that's going on right now isn't a big deal. And, we've watched for 10 years as certain assaults on human rights and human dignity have kind of slowly increased. And you've got, the frog in the boiling water phenomenon there. So I do think that's a good point. We should ask ourselves, what are we ignoring right now? It's like with climate change. What are we ignoring right now that 50 years from now we're going to really regret ignoring?
I also do think that he pointed out that we do tell this narrative about US involvement in World War II that doesn't necessarily reflect the facts. And I think that that's important to point out, that we were really late to the game, right? Like, the war was wrapping up before we got involved. And it is very true that, just like might be familiar now, we also were very reluctant to let in people who were trying to get into the country and trying to flee the Nazi government. So I do think he had a point that we tell this story about victory gardens and working in factories and everyone doing their part to beat the Nazis, and that was not the whole story.
Yeah, and I thought that whole mythos we have around American war making, I thought that was a great point he made. It was about, 400,000 people we lost in World War II, and that's tragic, but Russia lost something like, 10 million?
The Soviet Union had 24 million casualties. China had 20 million. And the United States had the least casualties with 420,000.
Oh, yeah, we leave China out too. No one ever talks about China. So we're not even educated about the war that we constantly look to as the one that we were glorious heroes in.
I think that points to another point, that there's this discrepancy between the war that we imagine, the ideal war we imagine, and the actuality of war. Until we can kind of have these two narratives match as much as possible, we never will be able to talk about whether a war is actually just, or whether such a thing as a just war exists. Because there's always going to be this glorification. I mean, back into ancient Rome and Greek times, right? There's this glorification of war and this kind of failure to acknowledge why it's actually happening and what the actual results are.
And like, if you look at all of our war movies, how many of them are remotely realistic at all? And it's funny you mentioned the Greeks and the Romans, because, you know, we read the Iliad as this glorious war story, but kind of the point of the Iliad at the end is that this whole mythos around military heroism is pointless and empty. And I'm just, you know, how often was that taught over the past 3,000 years?
So as we start to talk about the bigger picture, if you were going to preach a sermon on the topic, what would your sermon be?
I think I would say that we need to do much more to work for peace now. And that often means waking up to the injustices that are happening all around us, because if we ignore them, there's a pretty good chance that things will escalate to the point that the only option left that we can think of is to do more violence. And if we would only act justly and act peacefully in small things, perhaps we could minimize the amount of devastation that we're enacting.
I think our conversation with David really pointed out the difficulty we have in imagining anything except violence as inevitable. And regardless of whether I think some of his answers were fully satisfying or not, there's a sermon in there about the limits of our imagination to imagine a peaceful world. And that imagination is what Christ calls us to do. It's what the Bible tells us to do. And yet it is so hard for even people who consider themselves pacifists to imagine what that looks like in practice.
And that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Do you think there's such thing as a just war? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us next week when we talk about Catholic teaching on climate change.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to share a special offer for Glad You Asked listeners. Glad You Asked podcast is a project of U.S. Catholic Magazine, which is published by the USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries. This season, we're offering listeners 25% off a print or digital subscription to U.S. Catholic. Subscribe now and see why the Catholic Media Association recently named us the best Catholic general interest magazine for the 4th year in a row. To claim this special offer, visit uscatholic.org/GYA subscribe.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Sana, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. We're produced by Stephanie Clary and Joki Mercuria, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.